Hello everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
A question in hard times. Have you ever looked at your bank account and wondered if love was enough? Not enough for a vacation. Not enough for a bigger house. Not enough for a comfortable life. Just enough to keep going one more day. If you have ever felt tired, discouraged, or ready to quit something important, then this story may feel strangely familiar. Today, I want to share a very personal story. It is a story about life in the United States. It is a story about marriage, family, dreams, and the difficult years that almost broke us. Most importantly, it is a story about what happened when two people had almost no money but plenty of love. And what happened next surprised even us. Before we begin, take a slow breath and listen carefully. This story is written in simple English for listening practice, reading practice, and speaking practice. You can repeat the sentences aloud if you want. There is no rush. We will walk through this journey together. Many years ago, my wife and I were standing in a small grocery store in America. We were not arguing. We were not angry. We were trying to decide whether we could afford a box of cereal. That sounds funny now. But at the time, it did not feel funny at all. We checked prices carefully. We compared brands. We counted every dollar. We even put some items back on the shelf before going to the checkout counter. When people imagine life in America, they often picture success, large houses, shiny cars, and endless opportunities. Sometimes those things are real. But there is another side of the story. There are people working long hours. There are families living paycheck to paycheck. There are couples trying to build a future while carrying stress every single day. We were one of those couples. Our apartment was small. Very small. The bedroom felt like a storage closet with a bed inside it. The kitchen was so tiny that if one person opened the refrigerator door, the other person had to step aside. When winter arrived, cold air seemed to enter from every corner of the apartment. Sometimes I joked that the wind knew our address better than our friends did. My wife laughed every time I said it. That laugh became one of the most valuable things in my life. Because laughter was free. And at that time, free things were important. Many evenings, we sat at our old table drinking inexpensive coffee and talking about the future. Not the future we had. The future we hoped to have. We talked about children. We talked about a home. We talked about financial security. We talked about traveling someday. The funny thing about dreams is that they are easy to discuss when everything is going well. The real test comes when life becomes difficult. Psychologists often say that uncertainty creates stress because the human brain wants predictable outcomes. We like knowing what will happen tomorrow. We like feeling in control. But our future felt uncertain. Some months, unexpected bills appeared. Some weeks, work hours were reduced. Some days, even simple problems felt much bigger because we were already exhausted. Have you ever noticed that a small problem feels enormous when you are tired? A delayed payment becomes a disaster. A broken appliance becomes a crisis. A bad day becomes evidence that everything is falling apart. The brain has a habit of turning temporary struggles into permanent fears. I know because mine did it constantly. One evening, I sat alone after work and asked myself a question. What if love is not enough? It was a frightening thought. I did not tell anyone. Not even my wife. I carried that question quietly. What if effort is not enough? What if dreams are not enough? What if we work hard for years and still fail? Those questions followed me everywhere. At work. In the car. At night. Even during weekends. And maybe you understand that feeling. Maybe your challenge is learning English. Maybe your challenge is money. Maybe it is a relationship. Maybe it is simply finding hope after disappointment. Whatever it is, the feeling is similar. You keep moving forward while secretly wondering if your efforts matter. The strange thing is that life rarely answers those questions immediately. Life whispers. It does not shout. The answers arrive slowly. Sometimes they arrive years later. At that point in my life, I did not know that our biggest struggles were preparing us for opportunities we could not yet see. I did not know that the small apartment would become one of our favorite memories. I did not know that the difficult conversations would strengthen our marriage. I did not know that the fear we felt would eventually become gratitude. I certainly did not know that one ordinary decision would change everything. That decision seemed small at first. Almost invisible. The kind of choice most people would never remember. Yet it became the turning point of our entire story. But before I tell you about that moment, you need to understand something important. We did not become successful overnight. There was no magical solution. No secret formula. No lucky lottery ticket. What happened next came from hundreds of tiny actions repeated again and again. Small choices. Small sacrifices. Small acts of faith. And perhaps that is why this story matters. Because most real transformations do not begin with a dramatic breakthrough. They begin with an ordinary day when someone decides not to quit. Looking back now, I realize we were richer than we thought. Not because of our bank account. Not because of our possessions. Not because of our circumstances. We were rich because we still believed in each other. And sometimes that belief is worth more than anything money can buy. The question that haunted me for years was simple. We had no money. But we had plenty of love. Would that really be enough? The answer was waiting just around the corner. And when it finally arrived, it changed everything. Our tiny first apartment. There is a strange truth about happiness that nobody told me when I was younger. Sometimes the memories that shine brightest in your mind were created during the years when you had almost nothing. At the time, those moments feel ordinary. Sometimes they even feel painful. Yet years later, they become treasures. Our first apartment in America was one of those treasures, although if you had seen it back then, you probably would have laughed and asked how two adults could possibly live there. The building was old. The carpet looked older. The paint on the walls seemed to have survived several generations. When it rained, strange sounds came from the pipes. When the wind blew, the windows rattled as if they were nervous about the weather. It was not the kind of place people proudly showed on social media. It was the kind of place people planned to leave as soon as possible. Yet that tiny apartment became the stage for one of the most important chapters of our lives. Every morning began with a simple routine. I woke up early for work while my wife prepared breakfast in a kitchen barely large enough for one person. If I stepped backward while making coffee, I risked bumping into the refrigerator. If she opened a cabinet door, I had to move out of the way. We joked that our apartment was helping us strengthen our marriage because there was literally nowhere to hide from each other. At first, living that way felt exciting. We were young. We were hopeful. We believed hard work would quickly solve our financial problems. But life had other plans. The cost of living seemed to rise faster than our income. Rent was due every month with perfect consistency. Utility bills arrived like uninvited guests. Groceries became more expensive. Gas prices fluctuated. Unexpected expenses appeared with incredible timing, usually right after we thought we had finally saved a little money. Have you ever noticed how life sometimes behaves like a comedian with questionable timing? Just when you start feeling comfortable, something breaks. A tire goes flat. A medical bill arrives. An appliance stops working. It is almost as if the universe enjoys testing your confidence. We experienced all of it. Yet something interesting was happening beneath the surface. According to psychological studies, couples who face challenges together often build stronger emotional bonds when they communicate effectively and support one another. At the time, I did not know the science. I only knew that every challenge forced us to become a team. Instead of blaming each other, we learned to solve problems together. Instead of focusing on what we lacked, we tried to appreciate what we still had. Some evenings we could not afford entertainment. There were no expensive dinners. No luxury vacations. No shopping sprees. Instead, we sat on an old couch and talked. We talked about dreams. We talked about our future children. We talked about the kind of family we wanted to build. Sometimes we simply watched people walking outside our window and invented stories about them. Looking back, those conversations were worth more than many expensive experiences. Modern life often teaches people that happiness comes from acquiring more. More money. More possessions. More status. More convenience. But our little apartment taught us a different lesson. Happiness often comes from connection. From feeling understood. From laughing at problems together. From sharing a difficult journey with someone who refuses to leave your side. One particular winter stands out in my memory. If you have never experienced a cold American winter, it can feel surprisingly intense. The air seemed sharp enough to cut through clothing. The mornings were dark. The evenings arrived early. Some days the sky remained gray for hours. Even inside the apartment, we could feel the cold. We wore extra layers. We drank more coffee. We searched constantly for ways to reduce expenses. During that season, something unexpected happened. I began noticing how differently people responded to hardship. Some coworkers complained endlessly. Others remained optimistic despite facing bigger problems than ours. Researchers often explain that resilience is not about avoiding difficulties. It is about how people interpret them. Two people can experience the same challenge and reach completely different emotional outcomes. One sees proof of failure. The other sees an opportunity to grow. I started paying attention to that idea. Every time I felt discouraged, I asked myself a simple question. Was this situation permanent, or was it temporary? Most of the time, the answer was obvious. Temporary. The problem felt permanent because emotions are excellent storytellers. They exaggerate. They dramatize. They convince you that today's struggle will last forever. Reality is usually much kinder than that. My wife understood this instinctively. Whenever I worried about money, she reminded me of what was going right. We were healthy. We were together. We had food. We had a roof over our heads. We still had hope. Hope may sound like a small thing, but it is remarkably powerful. People can survive astonishing challenges when they believe tomorrow might be better than today. That belief carried us through many difficult months. Then one evening, something happened that I still remember clearly. We were reviewing our finances at the kitchen table. The numbers were not impressive. In fact, they were disappointing. We sat quietly for several minutes. The room felt heavy. The future felt uncertain again. Finally, my wife smiled and said something unexpected. "One day, we'll laugh about all of this." I wanted to believe her. Honestly, I wasn't sure she was right. The situation did not seem funny. It seemed stressful. But she smiled anyway. And somehow that smile changed the atmosphere in the room. Scientists often talk about emotional contagion, the tendency for emotions to spread from one person to another. Maybe that is what happened. Her optimism became my optimism. Her calm became my calm. Her confidence became my confidence. Years later, I discovered she was absolutely right. We do laugh about those days now. But at that moment, sitting in that tiny apartment, we had no idea what was coming next. We did not know that a new challenge was already approaching. We did not know that our next obstacle would test us in a completely different way. And we certainly did not know that one simple skill, a skill many people take for granted, would soon become one of the most important tools for changing our future. That skill was English. And our struggle to learn it was about to begin. Learning English together. Nobody warns you that learning English can feel a little like trying to ride a bicycle in the dark while someone keeps moving the road. One day you understand a conversation perfectly. The next day a cashier asks a simple question, and suddenly your brain forgets every English word it has ever learned. If you have ever experienced that feeling, you already understand how our next chapter began. At first, I thought money was our biggest problem. Then I realized something deeper was holding us back. It was communication. We lived in America, worked in America, paid bills in America, and dreamed about building a future in America. Yet every day we faced situations that reminded us our English was far from perfect. Sometimes I understood only half of what people said. Sometimes I understood the words but missed the meaning. Sometimes I smiled politely while secretly hoping nobody would ask a follow-up question. My wife experienced the same thing. One afternoon she returned home after a simple shopping trip looking frustrated. A store employee had asked her several questions, and although she answered politely, she later admitted she understood only parts of the conversation. Nothing terrible happened. Nobody laughed at her. Nobody was rude. Yet she felt disappointed. She felt limited. That evening we sat together at our small kitchen table and discussed something important. What if learning English was not just about language? What if it was actually the key to changing our future? The more we talked, the more obvious the answer became. Better English could help us find better opportunities. Better English could reduce stress. Better English could help us build friendships. Better English could help us feel more confident. It would not solve every problem, but it might unlock doors we could not even see yet. So we made a decision. We would learn together. The plan sounded simple. The reality was not. Learning a language as an adult is an interesting experience. Children seem to absorb words like sponges. Adults often absorb words like bricks. Heavy, slow bricks. Sometimes I learned a phrase on Monday and forgot it by Wednesday. Sometimes I practiced pronunciation for days only to discover I was still saying a word incorrectly. Researchers often explain that adults learn differently because they already have established language systems in their brains. That explanation was comforting, but it did not make learning any easier. Still, we refused to quit. Every evening became practice time. We listened to simple English conversations. We watched television programs with subtitles. We repeated sentences aloud. We read short stories together. Sometimes we even turned ordinary household activities into English lessons. If I opened the refrigerator, I named the food in English. If we walked through a store, we described what we saw. At first it felt awkward. Then it became normal. One night, we laughed for nearly 10 minutes because I confidently pronounced a word completely wrong. I was so sure I was correct that I even tried explaining why. Unfortunately, confidence and accuracy are not always close friends. My wife finally showed me the correct pronunciation, and I realized I had been saying it incorrectly for weeks. Instead of feeling embarrassed, we laughed. Looking back, those moments were surprisingly important. Educational psychologists often emphasize that positive emotions improve learning. When people enjoy the process, they stay engaged longer. Fear makes learning harder. Curiosity makes learning easier. Laughter helps the brain relax. Without realizing it, we were creating an environment that made progress possible. Small progress, but progress nonetheless. The changes were gradual. Almost invisible at first. One day I noticed I could understand more during workplace conversations. A few weeks later, I participated in a discussion without feeling nervous. Then my wife successfully handled a complicated conversation at a store without asking for help. Tiny victories began appearing everywhere. Most people underestimate the power of tiny victories. They seem insignificant in the moment. Yet success is often built from hundreds of small improvements stacked together over time. The brain loves visible results, but real growth usually happens quietly. Like a tree growing roots underground before anyone sees the branches. One Saturday morning we visited a local cafe. Normally I avoided long conversations with strangers. That day something felt different. When the employee asked how my morning was going, I answered naturally. We exchanged a few sentences. Nothing extraordinary happened. The conversation lasted less than a minute. Yet I walked away feeling strangely proud. Not because my English was perfect. It definitely was not. I felt proud because fear no longer controlled the interaction. Confidence had started replacing hesitation. My wife noticed the same change in herself. She became more willing to ask questions. More willing to speak first. More willing to make mistakes publicly. That last part may be the most important lesson of all. Many people delay learning because they are afraid of mistakes. But mistakes are not evidence of failure. They are evidence of participation. Nobody learns a language without making them. In fact, some language researchers argue that mistakes are essential because they help the brain adjust and improve. Unfortunately, our brains often treat mistakes as emergencies. They are not emergencies. They are information. Every mistake teaches something useful if we are willing to learn from it. As our English improved, something unexpected happened. Opportunities started appearing. Not dramatic opportunities. Not life-changing opportunities. At least not yet. But small opportunities. New conversations. New connections. New possibilities. It felt as though our world was slowly becoming larger. Imagine standing in a room with only one window. Then imagine opening a second window. Then a third. The room itself does not change, but suddenly you can see more of the world outside. That was how learning English felt. Every new word opened another window. Every conversation expanded the horizon. Every successful interaction increased our confidence. Yet just as we started feeling hopeful, another challenge was approaching. A challenge neither of us expected. A challenge that would test not only our English, not only our finances, but also the strength of our relationship. Winter was coming again. Bills were increasing. Work was becoming uncertain. And a difficult season was waiting right around the corner. At the time, we believed we were finally moving forward. We had no idea that our hardest test was about to begin. Winter tested everything. There is a reason people say you never truly understand winter until you live through a difficult one. I am not talking about beautiful snow falling gently outside your window while holiday music plays in the background. I am talking about the kind of winter that arrives carrying bills, uncertainty, exhaustion, and fear. The kind of winter that seems determined to test every promise you have ever made to yourself. For us, that winter arrived quietly. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The temperatures dropped. The days became shorter. Darkness arrived before dinner. The trees stood bare against gray skies. It looked like an ordinary American winter. But beneath the surface, trouble was beginning to grow. It started with work. One afternoon, rumors began spreading through the company. Nobody knew exactly what was happening, but everyone felt it. Hours might be reduced. Projects might be delayed. Some positions might disappear entirely. In workplaces across America, uncertainty can spread faster than any official announcement. Within days, people were whispering in hallways, exchanging worried looks, and speculating about the future. I tried to stay calm. I told myself not to worry about problems that had not happened yet. Psychologists call this anticipatory anxiety. The mind creates stress based on future possibilities rather than current realities. It is surprisingly common. Unfortunately, knowing the definition does not make the feeling disappear. Every morning I checked my email with nervous anticipation. Every meeting felt important. Every conversation seemed loaded with hidden meaning. Then the news arrived. My hours would be reduced temporarily. The company framed it as a short-term adjustment. Maybe it would be. Maybe it would not. All I knew was that our income was about to shrink while our expenses remained exactly the same. That evening, I sat in my car after work for several minutes before driving home. I stared through the windshield and calculated numbers in my head. Rent. Utilities. Insurance. Groceries. Gas. The math was not encouraging. Human beings often imagine that stress arrives like a lightning strike. In reality, it often behaves more like water slowly filling a room. Inch by inch. Day by day. By the time you realize how deep it has become, you are already standing knee-deep in it. When I finally walked through the apartment door, my wife immediately noticed something was wrong. She always could. Some people can detect changes in facial expressions with incredible accuracy. She was one of those people. Before I even explained the situation, she knew. We sat together at our little kitchen table. The same table where we had shared dreams, practiced English, and planned our future. Now it became the headquarters for problem solving. Again. We reviewed our finances. We looked for expenses to cut. We discussed temporary solutions. We tried to stay positive. But positivity becomes harder when uncertainty continues growing. Weeks passed. Temperatures dropped further. Heating costs increased. The apartment seemed colder every day. Sometimes I woke up in the middle of the night because the wind was rattling the windows. The sounds felt almost symbolic, as though the weather itself was reminding us how fragile our situation had become. During that period, I noticed something strange about the human brain. It rarely worries about one problem at a time. Instead, it collects concerns like a shopper filling a cart. Financial stress suddenly connected itself to career worries. Career worries connected themselves to relationship fears. Relationship fears connected themselves to long-term dreams. Before long, a single challenge felt like evidence that everything was falling apart. Neuroscientists often explain that the brain evolved to detect threats. Thousands of years ago, this ability helped humans survive. In modern life, however, the same system can exaggerate danger. A temporary setback begins feeling like permanent disaster. I experienced that firsthand. Some nights I struggled to sleep. I replayed conversations. I imagined worst-case scenarios. I created problems that did not even exist yet. Meanwhile, reality remained uncertain but manageable. That difference matters. Fear often tells stories that facts do not support. One evening, after another long day, I arrived home expecting more stress. Instead, I found my wife sitting on the couch reading one of our English practice books. She smiled and asked if I wanted to read together. Honestly, I almost said no. I felt tired, discouraged, frustrated. But I sat down anyway. We spent 30 minutes reading simple English stories aloud. Something unexpected happened. For those 30 minutes, the problems disappeared. Not permanently. Not magically. But temporarily. Researchers frequently discuss the importance of psychological recovery periods. The brain cannot remain in a constant state of stress without consequences. It needs moments of rest. Moments of focus. Moments of connection. That simple reading session became one of those moments. Soon it became a nightly habit again. No matter how difficult the day felt, we spent time practicing English together. Looking back, it was never just about language. It was about protecting hope. Every page reminded us that progress was still possible. Every conversation reminded us we were moving forward, even if slowly. Then another challenge arrived. Because apparently winter had decided we were not busy enough already. One morning, our aging car refused to start. At first, I assumed it was a minor issue. It was not. The repair estimate was far beyond what we wanted to hear. I remember staring at the number and thinking the mechanic must have accidentally included the price of a second car. Unfortunately, he had not. Now we faced another unexpected expense. Another decision. Another test. That night the apartment felt unusually quiet. We sat together without speaking much. Both of us were tired. Both of us were worried. Both of us were wondering how much more pressure our finances could handle. Yet something remarkable happened during that silence. Nobody blamed anyone. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody suggested giving up. Instead, my wife reached across the table and squeezed my hand. It was a small gesture. Almost invisible. Yet in that moment it felt more valuable than money. Relationship experts often emphasize that emotional support during stressful periods predicts long-term relationship satisfaction. Again, I did not know the research back then. I simply knew that her hand in mine made the future feel slightly less frightening. Winter continued. The bills continued. The uncertainty continued. But so did we. Day after day. Week after week. We kept moving forward. What neither of us realized was that the hardest emotional moment of our entire journey was still ahead. A moment that would arrive unexpectedly. A moment that would force us to confront our deepest fears. A moment when, for the first time, we would seriously question whether love alone could carry us through. And when that night finally arrived, everything changed. The night we almost gave up. Most people imagine that life-changing moments arrive with dramatic music, flashing lights, or a clear warning sign. In reality, they often arrive on ordinary evenings. No announcement. No preparation. Just a quiet moment when the weight of everything finally becomes too heavy to carry. The night we almost gave up began exactly like that. It was cold outside. The apartment felt unusually silent. Even the old pipes that normally made strange noises seemed to have stopped. After dinner, I sat at our small kitchen table surrounded by bills, receipts, and notes. The numbers were spread out in front of me like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. No matter how many times I recalculated, the result remained the same. There was not enough money. Not enough for comfort. Not enough for security. Not enough for the future we wanted. For months we had been stretching every dollar. We had reduced expenses. We had postponed purchases. We had worked hard. We had stayed optimistic. Yet somehow it still felt as though we were running uphill while carrying a backpack full of bricks. That evening, for the first time, I felt something dangerous creeping into my mind. Hopelessness. Psychologists describe hopelessness as one of the most difficult emotional states because it convinces people that effort no longer matters. When hope disappears, motivation often follows. I did not realize it at the time, but I was standing at the edge of that emotional cliff. My wife was sitting across from me. She looked tired too. Not physically tired. Emotionally tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying worries for too long. Neither of us spoke much. The silence felt heavy. Finally, I broke it. I asked a question that had been living in my head for months. What if this never gets better? The words hung in the air between us. Even after I said them, I wished I could take them back. They sounded darker out loud than they had inside my mind. My wife did not answer immediately. Instead, she stared at the table for several seconds. Then she quietly admitted something that surprised me. She had been asking herself the same question. Sometimes people assume strong relationships are built because couples never experience doubt. The opposite is often true. Strong relationships survive because people remain honest during doubt. That night there was plenty of doubt. We talked openly about our fears. We talked about money. We talked about work. We talked about dreams that felt farther away than ever. We talked about the possibility that life might never become easier. As strange as it sounds, those difficult conversations became one of the most important moments of our marriage. Researchers who study long-term relationships often find that emotional honesty creates deeper trust. Pretending everything is fine may reduce conflict temporarily, but genuine connection requires vulnerability. That night, we stopped pretending. We admitted we were scared. We admitted we felt overwhelmed. We admitted we were tired of struggling. The conversation lasted for hours. At some point, frustration turned into tears. Not dramatic movie-style tears. Just quiet tears from two people who had been carrying too much for too long. If you have ever reached a point where life felt heavier than expected, you probably understand. There comes a moment when strength no longer looks impressive. It looks exhausted. It looks uncertain. It looks human. Around midnight, I walked to the window and looked outside. Snow was falling gently under the streetlights. The city seemed peaceful. It was strange. The world outside appeared calm while my thoughts felt like a storm. Neuroscientists often explain that the brain pays far more attention to threats than positive experiences. This tendency helped our ancestors survive danger. Unfortunately, it can also make modern problems feel larger than they really are. Standing there at the window, I realized I had spent months focusing almost entirely on what was going wrong. Reduced work hours. Unexpected bills. Financial stress. Future uncertainty. Yet I had ignored something important. Despite everything, we were still standing. We had survived every difficult month so far. Every setback. Every disappointment. Every challenge. None of them had defeated us. That realization did not magically solve our problems. But it changed something inside me. Then my wife said something I will never forget. She reminded me of our first days together. Back then we had even less. Less money. Less experience. Less confidence. Less knowledge. Yet somehow we had still found reasons to believe in the future. If we survived that, she said softly, why are we acting like we can't survive this? It was such a simple question. Yet it hit me harder than any motivational speech ever could. Sometimes the truth arrives disguised as a simple sentence. We had become so focused on the mountain ahead that we forgot how far we had already climbed. Human beings do this constantly. We normalize our progress. We adapt to improvements. We forget previous victories. Psychologists call this hedonic adaptation. What once felt impossible becomes ordinary. Looking back, our journey already contained dozens of small victories. Our English had improved. Our communication had improved. Our relationship had grown stronger. We had learned resilience. We had built habits. We had gained experience. None of those achievements appeared on a bank statement, but they were real. Slowly, the atmosphere in the room began changing. The fear remained, but it no longer controlled the conversation. Instead of asking why life was difficult, we started discussing what we could do next. The difference may seem small. It was not. One mindset focuses on problems. The other focuses on possibilities. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, we made a decision. We would stop measuring progress only through money. Of course, finances mattered. But they would not become the sole definition of success. Instead, we would focus on actions we could control. Learning. improving, supporting each other, building skills, staying consistent, small steps, every day, no matter what. Looking back now, I believe that decision saved us. Not financially. Emotionally. It prevented temporary circumstances from becoming permanent beliefs. Before going to bed, my wife smiled and said something unexpected. Maybe this is the part of the story we'll tell our children someday. At the time, that seemed impossible. Children felt like a distant dream. Stability felt distant. The future felt distant. Yet for the first time in months, I laughed. A real laugh. Not because our problems were gone. They weren't. But because hope had quietly returned to the room. We went to sleep believing nothing had changed. We were wrong. Everything had changed. The next morning would look ordinary. The apartment would be the same. The bills would still exist. The challenges would remain. Yet something inside us was different. We had stopped asking whether we could survive. We had started asking how far we could go. And only a few weeks later, an unexpected series of small habits would begin changing our lives in ways we never imagined possible. Small habits changed. If someone had told me that a few tiny daily habits would eventually change our future, I probably would have laughed. Not because I disagreed, but because our problems felt too large for small solutions. When bills are piling up, when work feels uncertain, when your dreams seem far away, the idea that reading a few pages, learning a few new words, or making a simple plan could matter sounds almost ridiculous. Yet that is exactly what happened. The strange thing about transformation is that it rarely announces itself. It does not knock on your door and say, "Congratulations, your life is about to improve." Instead, it hides inside ordinary routines. Tiny actions. Repeated quietly. Day after day. After the difficult night when my wife and I nearly lost hope, we made a promise. We would stop obsessing over results we could not control and focus on actions we could control. It sounded simple. It sounded almost too simple. But simplicity is often underestimated. Most people are searching for dramatic breakthroughs while ignoring the power of consistent effort. We started with mornings. Instead of waking up and immediately thinking about problems, we spent 15 minutes reading English together. 15 minutes. That was all. Some mornings we were tired. Some mornings we felt unmotivated. Some mornings we wanted to skip it. But we did it anyway. Researchers studying habit formation often explain that consistency matters more than intensity. A small action performed regularly creates stronger long-term change than a large action performed occasionally. At the time, I did not know the science. I only knew that 15 minutes felt manageable. Soon those 15 minutes became automatic. Then something unexpected happened. Our conversations improved. We learned new vocabulary naturally. We became more confident. The progress was slow enough to be almost invisible. Yet week after week, the improvement continued. Around the same time, we introduced another habit. Every evening, before going to sleep, we spent 10 minutes discussing one positive thing that happened during the day. At first, this felt difficult. During stressful periods, the brain becomes remarkably skilled at noticing problems. Positive moments often go unnoticed. But once we started searching for them intentionally, we discovered they were everywhere. A productive conversation. A helpful coworker. A new English phrase learned correctly. A good meal. A funny joke. A peaceful walk. Tiny moments that previously disappeared without attention suddenly became meaningful. Psychologists call this attentional focus. What you consistently look for often shapes your emotional experience. If you search for evidence that life is terrible, your brain will happily provide examples. If you search for reasons to remain hopeful, your brain will find those too. Neither approach changes reality. It changes perception. And perception influences behavior. Another habit followed. We began creating simple weekly plans. Not complicated plans. Not 50-page strategies. Just a few clear goals. Learn 10 new English words. Save a small amount of money. Apply for one new opportunity. Complete one personal project. The goals seemed modest. Sometimes they felt almost embarrassingly small. Yet something remarkable happened. We started winning again. Human beings need progress. Even tiny progress. Neuroscientists have found that achieving goals can activate reward systems in the brain, creating positive momentum. Momentum is powerful. Success breeds confidence. Confidence encourages action. Action creates more success. Soon our tiny victories began stacking on top of one another. One evening I realized something surprising. We were laughing more often. The circumstances had not changed dramatically. The apartment was still small. Money was still tight. Challenges still existed. Yet our emotional experience felt different. Why? Because we were no longer waiting passively for life to improve. We were participating in the process. There is a profound difference between feeling stuck and feeling in motion. Even slow movement feels better than standing still. Around that time, I also began paying closer attention to successful people around me. Not celebrities. Not wealthy entrepreneurs on social media. Ordinary people. Coworkers. Neighbors. Community members. I noticed something interesting. Most of them did not possess extraordinary talent. They simply maintained ordinary habits longer than others. They kept showing up. They kept learning. They kept improving. They kept going when progress felt slow. The realization changed my perspective completely. Success suddenly seemed less mysterious. Less magical. More practical. One Saturday afternoon, my wife and I visited a local library. We had gone there many times before, but this visit felt different. As we walked between shelves filled with books, I felt a sense of possibility. Libraries have always fascinated me. Imagine a building filled with thousands of people sharing knowledge across generations. Every book represents lessons learned, mistakes survived, challenges overcome. That afternoon, we borrowed several books about communication, personal growth, and language learning. They were not expensive. In fact, they were free. Yet the ideas inside them would prove surprisingly valuable. One concept stood out immediately. Improvement often happens gradually until a threshold is reached. Water heats slowly before it boils. Seeds grow unseen before breaking through the soil. Skills develop quietly before becoming noticeable. The idea resonated deeply with me because it perfectly described our experience. We had been improving for months. The changes simply had not become obvious yet. Then came a moment I still remember vividly. During a meeting at work, I found myself contributing confidently to a discussion. Halfway through the conversation, I realized something astonishing. I was not translating every sentence in my head anymore. I was simply communicating. The realization felt incredible. Not because my English was perfect. It certainly was not. But because progress had become visible. That evening I told my wife what happened. She smiled and shared a similar experience from her own day. We celebrated with inexpensive takeout food and laughed about how excited we were over something many people considered ordinary. Yet that is the beauty of growth. Personal victories matter most to the people who fought for them. As the weeks continued, opportunities slowly began appearing. New conversations. New responsibilities. New possibilities. Nothing dramatic. Nothing life-changing. At least not yet. But there was movement. Real movement. Looking back, I can see exactly when our future started changing. Not during a major breakthrough. Not during a lucky moment. Not during a sudden financial windfall. It began when we committed to small daily actions and trusted the process. What we did not know was that those habits were preparing us for something much bigger. Because while we were busy building better routines, an opportunity was quietly approaching. An opportunity connected to work. An opportunity connected to our growing confidence. An opportunity that had the potential to change our financial situation completely. We could not see it yet. We did not know it existed. But the door was already beginning to open. A better opportunity appeared. Have you ever noticed how opportunities rarely arrive when you are desperately searching for them? Sometimes they appear only after you have stopped staring at the door and started improving yourself instead. Looking back now, that is exactly what happened to us. For years, I believed success would arrive as one dramatic event. A perfect job offer. A sudden financial breakthrough. A miracle that would instantly solve our problems. Real life turned out to be much less dramatic and far more interesting. The opportunity that changed our future arrived disguised as an ordinary Tuesday. Nothing about that morning felt special. The weather was average. Traffic was frustrating as usual. My coffee tasted exactly the same as it had the day before. If someone had told me that my life was about to change, I would have laughed and continued driving to work. Yet sometimes the biggest chapters begin on the most ordinary days. A few months earlier, our daily habits had started producing visible results. My English had improved. My confidence had improved. My communication skills had improved. Most importantly, my mindset had improved. Instead of focusing constantly on what was missing, I had learned to focus on growth. At work, people began noticing. Not immediately. Not dramatically. Just little things. I volunteered for tasks I previously avoided. I participated more often during meetings. I communicated more clearly with coworkers. I asked questions instead of pretending I understood everything. Ironically, admitting what I did not know made me appear more confident rather than less confident. Leadership experts often point out that genuine confidence comes from honesty, not perfection. People trust those who are willing to learn. One afternoon, my supervisor asked if we could talk privately. The moment he said those words, my brain immediately assumed something was wrong. Human beings have a remarkable ability to imagine disasters. We can transform a simple meeting invitation into a full psychological thriller within seconds. As I walked toward his office, I mentally prepared for bad news. Reduced hours again. New budget cuts. Additional problems. Instead, he surprised me. He told me that he had noticed my progress over the past year. He mentioned my communication skills, my reliability, my willingness to learn. Then he said something I never expected to hear. A new position might become available soon, and he thought I should consider applying. For several seconds, I simply stared at him. My brain seemed unable to process the information. Me? The same person who once struggled through basic conversations? The same person who spent years doubting his abilities? Apparently, yes. After the meeting ended, I sat alone in my car for nearly 10 minutes. Not because I was worried. Because I was shocked. Opportunities have a strange way of revealing how much we have changed. Until that moment, I had focused mostly on what still needed improvement. Suddenly, I was forced to recognize how far I had already come. That evening, I shared the news with my wife. Her reaction was immediate. She smiled so widely that I knew she had believed in me long before I believed in myself. Sometimes the people who love us can see our growth before we can. Yet there was a complication. The position would involve greater responsibility. More communication. More visibility. More opportunities to make mistakes. In other words, exactly the kind of challenge that once terrified me. Fear has an interesting habit of returning whenever we approach meaningful opportunities. Psychologists often describe this as growth discomfort. The brain prefers familiarity because familiarity feels safe. New opportunities often require new identities, new behaviors, new levels of confidence. That transition can feel uncomfortable even when it is positive. For several days, I wrestled with doubt. What if I was not ready? What if I failed? What if everyone eventually realized I was not qualified? Researchers call this imposter syndrome. It affects people across industries, experience levels, and backgrounds. The fascinating part is that many highly capable individuals experience it precisely because they care about doing well. One evening, while discussing the situation with my wife, she asked a question that completely changed my perspective. Do you remember when speaking English at the grocery store felt impossible? Of course I remembered. And do you remember when reading a simple book felt difficult? I nodded. And do you remember when we thought surviving that winter would be impossible? Again, yes. Then she smiled. You were not ready for those challenges either. You became ready by facing them. That sentence stayed with me. Sometimes we wait for confidence before taking action. More often, confidence arrives after action. The next morning, I submitted my application. Then came the waiting period. Waiting may be one of the most underrated forms of stress. Your imagination works overtime. Every email notification feels important. Every phone call feels significant. Every delay feels meaningful. During those weeks, I focused on what had brought us this far. Daily habits. Learning. Consistency. Improvement. No matter what happened, those things remained valuable. Then the call finally came. I still remember exactly where I was standing when I answered. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. Yet those minutes altered the direction of our lives. I got the position. For a moment, everything felt quiet. Not outside. Inside. The doubts stopped. The worries paused. The years of effort suddenly connected to a visible outcome. I wish I could say I celebrated like people do in movies. I did not. I simply sat down and smiled. Then I called my wife. When she answered, she knew immediately. She could hear it in my voice. That evening, we celebrated with a modest dinner. Nothing extravagant. Nothing expensive. But it felt special because it represented more than a promotion. It represented possibility. Financially, the change would help us significantly. Emotionally, it meant even more. For years, our story had been dominated by survival. Now, for the first time, we could begin thinking about growth. The future suddenly looked different. Brighter. Whiter. More open. Yet the most surprising chapter of all was still waiting ahead. Because just as our financial situation began improving, life prepared another unexpected gift. A gift that would bring joy, responsibility, sleepless nights, laughter, and a completely new definition of love. We did not know it yet, but our family was about to grow. And everything we thought we understood about life was about to change forever. Welcoming our first child. There are moments in life that divide your story into two chapters. The chapter before and the chapter after. Before that moment, you think you understand responsibility. You think you understand love. You think you understand what matters most. Then something happens, and suddenly the entire world rearranges itself around a new center. For us, that moment arrived on an ordinary afternoon. I still remember the expression on my wife's face. She looked excited. Nervous. Happy. Terrified. Somehow all at the same time. When she told me the news, my brain stopped working for a few seconds. I simply stared at her. Then I smiled. Then I laughed. Then I worried. Then I smiled again. We were going to have a baby. Even now, years later, I can remember exactly how that sentence felt. It was exciting because it represented everything we had dreamed about. It was terrifying because we immediately started thinking about practical realities. Babies, as it turns out, do not accept payment in hope and optimism. They require food, clothing, healthcare, time, attention, and approximately 1 million things nobody warns you about beforehand. For a few days, we floated through life in a strange mixture of joy and panic. We celebrated. We planned. We imagined the future. Then we looked at our finances and briefly considered panicking again. Fortunately, excitement won. Looking back, I realized that becoming parents began changing us long before our child was born. Suddenly, every decision felt more important. We became more careful with money. More intentional with our time. More focused on long-term goals. Psychologists often describe this as a shift in identity. When people become parents, their priorities frequently reorganize around future responsibility. That description sounds academic. In reality, it means you suddenly find yourself researching strollers at midnight and comparing diaper prices like a professional economist. The months passed surprisingly quickly. During that time, we continued many of the habits that had helped us grow. We still practiced English together. We still discussed our goals. We still looked for small daily improvements. The difference was that every plan now included a new family member. Sometimes we sat together imagining what our child would be like. Would they be quiet or energetic? Serious or playful? Would they enjoy reading? Sports? Music? We had no answers. Only curiosity. One thing fascinated me in particular. Our child would grow up experiencing a very different America than we had. We arrived carrying uncertainty, language challenges, and financial struggles. Our child would begin life surrounded by opportunities we had spent years creating. That thought motivated me more than any promotion ever could. Then came the hospital day. If you have ever become a parent, you already know what I am about to say. No amount of preparation truly prepares you. Books help. Advice helps. Experience from others helps. Yet when the moment arrives, it feels entirely unique. I remember driving to the hospital feeling strangely calm. That calm lasted approximately 12 minutes. After that, nervousness took over. The hours that followed seemed both incredibly long and unbelievably fast. Time behaved strangely. Minutes stretched. Then suddenly disappeared. Emotions shifted constantly. Hope. Fear. Excitement. Gratitude. Anticipation. Then it happened. Our child entered the world. For a brief moment, everything else disappeared. The bills. The stress. The years of struggle. The long winters. The uncertainty. None of it mattered. There was only that moment. Researchers often talk about peak emotional experiences, moments that become permanently etched into memory because of their emotional significance. That was one of mine. I held my child and felt something difficult to describe. It was not merely happiness. It was deeper than that. It was responsibility mixed with wonder. Love mixed with humility. A powerful awareness that life was no longer only about me. The funny thing is that movies often end when the baby arrives. Real life is just getting started. The first weeks were beautiful and chaotic. Sleep became a distant memory. I learned that a person can function on far less rest than previously believed. Scientists may have official research on sleep deprivation. New parents conduct their own experiments every night. Some mornings I could not remember what day it was. Other mornings I celebrated successfully making coffee without forgetting the mug. Yet despite the exhaustion, something remarkable happened. Our apartment felt different. The same walls. The same furniture. The same rooms. Yet everything felt warmer. More meaningful. More alive. Suddenly ordinary moments became extraordinary. A smile. A laugh. A tiny hand gripping my finger. These moments carried more emotional value than expensive possessions ever could. Studies consistently show that meaningful relationships contribute strongly to long-term well-being. I understood that intellectually before becoming a parent. Afterward, I understood it emotionally. Of course, new challenges arrived too. Parenthood introduced responsibilities we had never faced before. Financial planning became more important. Scheduling became more complicated. Free time became surprisingly rare. Sometimes we felt overwhelmed. Sometimes we made mistakes. Sometimes we worried about things that turned out not to matter at all. Apparently, worrying is one of the few parenting skills that develops naturally. Yet even during difficult days, our perspective had changed. The struggles no longer felt pointless. Every effort served a purpose. Every sacrifice supported a future we could now see clearly. One evening, while holding my sleeping child, I found myself reflecting on our journey. Years earlier, my wife and I had sat in a tiny apartment wondering if love would be enough. Back then, the future felt uncertain. Now I looked around and realized something incredible. We still did not have a perfect life. We still faced challenges. We still had goals. Yet we had built something real. Something meaningful. Something worth protecting. The greatest surprise was not that our circumstances had improved. The greatest surprise was how much we had changed. The people who once doubted everything had become parents. The couple who once feared the future had started creating one. And while we were busy learning how to raise a child, life was preparing another lesson. Because building a family is one thing. Building a true home is something else entirely. That next chapter would teach us what it really means to create a life together, not just survive it. Building a real home. Most people think a home is something you buy. A building. A mortgage. A collection of rooms filled with furniture. I used to think that too. Then life taught me something unexpected. A house can be purchased. A home must be built. And the materials used to build it are rarely found in hardware stores. They are made from patience, trust, shared memories, late-night conversations, forgiveness, laughter, and thousands of ordinary moments that seem insignificant until years later. By the time our child arrived, our lives looked very different from those difficult years in the tiny apartment. Financially, things were improving. My career was moving forward. Our English had become much stronger. We felt more confident navigating life in America. Yet a surprising challenge appeared. We had spent so many years learning how to survive that we now had to learn how to live. There is a difference. Survival focuses on getting through today. Living requires thinking about tomorrow. Survival asks, how do we make it through this week? Living asks, what kind of family do we want to become? That question changed everything. One evening after putting our child to sleep, my wife and I sat together discussing the future. Not bills. Not problems. The future. It felt strangely unfamiliar. For years, most conversations had revolved around immediate needs. Now we found ourselves discussing values, traditions, goals, and family culture. We wanted our home to be a place where people felt safe. A place where learning was encouraged. A place where kindness mattered more than appearances. A place where mistakes were treated as opportunities rather than failures. These ideas may sound simple, but they became the foundation of our family. Researchers who study family systems often emphasize that children learn more from what parents consistently do than from what parents occasionally say. That realization influenced many of our decisions. If we wanted our child to value learning, we needed to keep learning ourselves. If we wanted kindness, we needed to practice kindness. If we wanted resilience, we needed to demonstrate resilience. In other words, parenting was not just about teaching. It was about modeling. Around this time, another interesting change occurred. Our weekends began looking different. During the difficult years, weekends often revolved around recovery. We were exhausted. We were stressed. We simply tried to rest. Now we started creating experiences. Family walks through local parks. Visits to libraries. Community events. Seasonal festivals. Small adventures that cost little but created lasting memories. One thing I came to appreciate about American culture is the variety of opportunities available for families. Different communities celebrate different traditions. Public spaces often encourage participation. Libraries host educational events. Parks become gathering places. Cultural festivals bring people together. We explored as much as we could. Every experience felt like another thread woven into the fabric of our new life. Of course, reality remained imperfect. Social media often creates the illusion that happy families live in a constant state of harmony. That has not been my experience. Real families are messy. Schedules become complicated. Children become cranky. Parents become tired. Plans change unexpectedly. Some days everything works beautifully. Other days you celebrate simply because nobody accidentally locked themselves in a bathroom. The important lesson was learning not to confuse imperfection with failure. Psychologists frequently discuss the concept of the good enough parent. The idea is surprisingly comforting. Children do not need perfect parents. They need present parents. Consistent parents. Loving parents. That perspective removed a great deal of unnecessary pressure from our lives. One memory from this period remains especially vivid. It happened on a completely ordinary evening. We were sitting around the dinner table. Nothing extraordinary was happening. No major achievement. No special occasion. Just dinner. Conversation. Laughter. At one point, I looked around the room and felt overwhelmed by gratitude. Years earlier, my wife and I had worried about affording groceries. Now we were sharing a meal with our child in a home filled with warmth and connection. The contrast felt remarkable. Human beings often adapt so quickly to improvements that we stop noticing them. That evening, for whatever reason, I noticed. Researchers call this gratitude awareness. Studies suggest that intentionally recognizing positive experiences can improve overall well-being and strengthen relationships. Again, I did not know the research at the time. I only knew that my heart felt full. As the months passed, another realization emerged. Success had changed its meaning. Earlier in life, I measured success primarily through financial outcomes. Income. Promotions. Stability. Those things still mattered. They always would. But they were no longer the entire picture. Success now included family dinners. Bedtime stories. Shared laughter. Meaningful conversations. Emotional connection. It included creating an environment where everyone felt valued. Interestingly, many happiness studies reach similar conclusions. Beyond basic financial security, relationship quality often predicts long-term life satisfaction more strongly than material possessions. Looking back, I can see why. Material achievements provide comfort. Relationships provide meaning. Both are valuable. One simply lasts longer. Around this period, our child began asking more questions about the world. Endless questions. Fascinating questions. Sometimes impossible questions. Children possess a remarkable ability to transform ordinary moments into adventures. A walk becomes an exploration. A puddle becomes a scientific investigation. A cardboard box becomes an engineering project. Watching this curiosity unfold reminded me of something important. Growth never really ends. Adults often assume learning belongs to children. In reality, everyone remains a student. Life simply changes the classroom. That mindset encouraged us to continue improving. Continue reading. Continue learning. Continue growing together. Little did we know, another chapter was already approaching. A chapter filled with deeper lessons about love, marriage, culture, and the hidden forces that keep families strong over time. We had spent years building our home. Soon we would begin understanding what truly holds it together. And the answer turned out to be far more powerful than money, career success, or even good luck. It was something much simpler and much more important. Lessons from family life. Imagine spending years chasing happiness only to discover it was quietly sitting beside you at the dinner table the entire time. That realization did not arrive all at once. It arrived slowly, hidden inside ordinary days. Days that seemed forgettable while they were happening. Days filled with school schedules, grocery shopping, work responsibilities, family conversations, and countless small moments that did not appear important until much later. By this stage of our journey, life looked very different from the years when my wife and I worried about every dollar. We were more stable, more experienced, more confident. Yet life continued teaching lessons. In fact, some of the most important lessons arrived after the hardest struggles were already behind us. One thing I learned about marriage is that people often misunderstand what makes relationships last. Movies teach us to focus on dramatic moments, grand gestures, perfect romance, spectacular surprises. Real life operates differently. Relationship researchers consistently find that long-term success often depends on small daily interactions rather than occasional dramatic events. Looking back, I can see this clearly. Our marriage survived difficult years not because of extraordinary moments but because of ordinary consistency. A kind word after a difficult day. A conversation when one person felt discouraged. A willingness to listen instead of immediately trying to solve every problem. A habit of choosing patience over pride. These actions seem small individually. Together, they become powerful. One evening, while cleaning up after dinner, my child asked a question that completely caught me off guard. "How did you and Mom stay together for so long?" The question seemed simple. The answer was not. I thought for a moment before responding. Finally, I said something that surprised even me. Because we kept choosing each other. Not once. Not during a wedding ceremony. Every day. Again and again. The truth is that strong relationships are not built through a single decision. They are built through thousands of decisions repeated over time. Decisions to communicate, to forgive, to support, to remain present. Psychologists often describe successful relationships as systems of positive reinforcement. The more kindness people share, the easier future kindness becomes. Positive patterns strengthen themselves. Negative patterns can do the same. Understanding this changed how I viewed marriage entirely. Another lesson came from raising children. Before becoming a parent, I assumed my primary responsibility would be teaching. After becoming a parent, I realized my primary responsibility was learning. Children notice everything. They notice how adults handle stress. How adults treat strangers. How adults react to disappointment. How adults celebrate success. Sometimes I felt as though my child was holding up a mirror to my own behavior. That experience forced me to become more intentional. If I wanted to raise a kind person, I needed to practice kindness. If I wanted resilience, I needed resilience. If I wanted curiosity, I needed curiosity. Family life became a continuous opportunity for personal growth. One fascinating aspect of life in America is the diversity of experiences surrounding you. Different cultures, different traditions, different perspectives. Over the years, our family encountered people from countless backgrounds. These experiences taught us something valuable. Most people want similar things: safety, belonging, opportunity, love, respect. The details vary. The human needs remain surprisingly consistent. This realization made me more open-minded, more patient, more willing to listen. Researchers studying social connection often emphasize that empathy increases when people interact with diverse communities. I experienced this firsthand. Every conversation expanded my understanding. Every friendship challenged assumptions. Every new perspective added depth to our lives. Then there was the lesson nobody talks about enough. Happiness is often quieter than expected. When I was younger, I imagined happiness as a destination. A point where all problems disappeared. A magical state of permanent satisfaction. Reality turned out to be more interesting. Happiness often arrives disguised as ordinary moments. Drinking coffee while everyone else is still asleep. Hearing laughter from another room. Taking a family walk on a pleasant afternoon. Finishing a long day and realizing everyone is safe. Positive psychology research supports this idea. Long-term well-being tends to come more from repeated positive experiences than from rare extraordinary events. In other words, happiness behaves less like fireworks and more like candlelight. Consistent. Gentle. Easy to overlook if you are constantly searching for something bigger. One weekend, while organizing old photographs, my wife and I discovered pictures from our first apartment. We sat together looking through them. The tiny kitchen. The worn furniture. The cramped living space. At first we laughed. Then we became quiet. Because those pictures represented more than a place. They represented a version of ourselves. Two people trying to build a future with very limited resources. Two people who had no idea what was coming next. Looking at those images felt almost surreal. It reminded us how much growth had occurred. Not only financially, emotionally, mentally, relationally. Growth rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. It becomes visible only when you compare who you are today with who you used to be. Another lesson emerged from that evening. Gratitude becomes easier when you remember where you started. Human beings adapt quickly. What once felt extraordinary becomes normal. What once felt impossible becomes expected. Without intentional reflection, progress can become invisible. Since then, I have tried to pause occasionally and appreciate the journey. Not because life is perfect. It is not. Every family faces challenges. Every marriage experiences difficult seasons. Every person encounters uncertainty. The goal is not perfection. The goal is perspective. And perspective changes everything. As our conversation continued that night, my wife smiled and pointed to one of the oldest photographs. "We thought we were struggling," she said. Then she laughed softly. We had no idea how strong we already were. That statement stayed with me. Strength often develops long before we recognize it. Courage often appears before confidence. Growth often happens before awareness. Looking back, I realized the hardest years had given us more than difficulties. They had given us wisdom. And that wisdom prepared us for the final lesson of our story. A lesson that would become clear only when we stepped back and looked at the entire journey from beginning to end. Because when we finally did, we discovered that the most valuable thing we had built was never our career, our finances, or even our home. It was something far more important. Something that had been with us from the very beginning. What truly made us rich? If someone had met us during our first years in America and asked whether we felt successful, the answer probably would have been no. We were struggling financially. We lived in a small apartment. We worried about bills. We worried about work. We worried about the future. Like many people, we assumed success existed somewhere ahead of us. Somewhere in the distance. Somewhere beyond the next promotion, the next paycheck, the next milestone. What we did not realize was that life was quietly teaching us a lesson that would take years to fully understand. The things that make you feel rich and the things that make you wealthy are not always the same. One Saturday morning, many years after those difficult seasons, I woke up earlier than everyone else. The house was quiet. Sunlight was beginning to enter through the windows. I walked into the kitchen and made a cup of coffee. Then I sat alone for a few minutes, listening to the silence. It was one of those rare moments when life slows down enough for you to notice it. As I sat there, memories began appearing one after another. The tiny apartment. The freezing winters. The long workdays. The nights spent worrying about money. The hours we spent learning English together. The moments when we nearly lost hope. The victories that seemed small at the time but later became turning points. And suddenly, I realized something that felt almost unbelievable. Many of the memories I treasured most came from the years when we had the least. That realization surprised me because it challenged everything I once believed about happiness. Society often sends a very clear message. More money equals more happiness. More possessions equal more satisfaction. More status equals more fulfillment. There is some truth to this. Financial stability matters. Security matters. Opportunity matters. Anyone who has struggled financially understands that money can reduce many forms of stress. But beyond a certain point, something interesting happens. The emotional return begins to shrink. Psychologists who study happiness frequently find that relationships, purpose, gratitude, and meaningful experiences often contribute more to long-term well-being than material possessions alone. Looking back at our story, I could see that pattern clearly. The moments that mattered most were rarely expensive. Teaching each other English at the kitchen table. Laughing over pronunciation mistakes. Walking through parks with our child. Sharing dreams late at night. Supporting one another during difficult seasons. These memories carried extraordinary emotional value despite costing almost nothing. Later that day, while helping my child with homework, another thought crossed my mind. Children rarely remember how much money their parents earned. They remember how their parents made them feel. They remember whether home felt safe. They remember whether they felt loved. They remember conversations, traditions, encouragement, and shared experiences. This idea has been supported repeatedly by developmental psychology research. Emotional security often influences children's long-term well-being more profoundly than many material advantages. That realization deepened my appreciation for everything we had built. Years earlier, my wife and I had worried constantly about providing enough. We rarely stopped to appreciate what we were already providing. Love, stability, presence, encouragement. Those gifts may not appear on financial statements, but they shape lives in powerful ways. One evening, our family gathered to look through old photographs again. By now, this had become a tradition. Every picture seemed to tell a story. Some photographs captured major milestones. Others captured ordinary days that had somehow become meaningful over time. What fascinated me most was how differently I viewed those images now. During difficult seasons, I focused primarily on what was missing. Looking back, I noticed what was present. Determination, partnership, growth, hope. It reminded me of an important psychological principle. Human beings are often poor judges of their current circumstances because they are standing too close to them. Distance creates clarity. Years later, struggles that once seemed overwhelming sometimes reveal hidden strengths. Challenges that once felt unfair sometimes reveal valuable lessons. Painful seasons occasionally become meaningful chapters. Of course, this does not mean every hardship is secretly wonderful. Some difficulties are simply difficult. But perspective can transform how we understand them. My wife understood this better than anyone. One night, after our child had gone to bed, we sat together talking about the past. We laughed about old mistakes. We remembered stressful situations that now seemed almost unbelievable. Then she said something that stopped me for a moment. If we could go back and change everything, would you? At first, the question seemed easy. Why wouldn't anyone remove years of stress and uncertainty? Yet the longer I thought about it, the more complicated the answer became. Because changing the difficulties would also change the lessons. It would change the resilience we developed. The gratitude we learned. The patience we practiced. The appreciation we now felt. Eventually, I shook my head. No. I would not change it. Not because I enjoyed the struggle. I didn't. But because the struggle helped create the people we became. Researchers who study post-traumatic growth have observed something fascinating. Some individuals emerge from challenges with increased appreciation for life, stronger relationships, and greater personal strength. Not because suffering is inherently good, but because growth can occur through the process of overcoming it. Our story reflected that idea. The hardships did not define us. Our response to them did. As the years continued, I noticed another change. Success no longer felt like a destination. It felt like a practice. A daily commitment to learning, loving, growing, and contributing. The finish line I once imagined simply did not exist. There was always another lesson. Another opportunity to improve. Another chance to help someone else. Strangely, this realization felt freeing rather than disappointing. If success is a practice, then every day offers another opportunity to participate. You do not need perfection. You need consistency. Looking around our home now, I see evidence of that truth everywhere. Not in expensive objects. In relationships. In memories. In traditions. In conversations. In laughter. in the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you survived difficult seasons together. And as I reflected on everything we had experienced, one final realization emerged. The title of our story had been true from the very beginning. We really did have very little money. But we had plenty of love. What we did not know back then was just how valuable that love would become. And the final chapter of our journey would prove it beyond any doubt. What happened next? If you had met me during those early years and shown me a picture of my future, I probably would not have believed you. Not because the future looked impossible. Because I had become so focused on surviving that I could no longer imagine thriving. That is one of the strangest things about difficult seasons. They narrow your vision. They convince you that today's problems are permanent. They make tomorrow seem smaller than it really is. Yet life has a remarkable way of surprising people who refuse to quit. Years have passed since the days when my wife and I sat in that tiny apartment wondering whether love would be enough. The apartment is gone now. The old furniture is gone. The financial stress that once followed us everywhere has faded into memory. Even some of the fears that felt overwhelming at the time have disappeared completely. But something important remains. The lessons. The gratitude. The relationships. The understanding that the most valuable parts of life often arrive disguised as ordinary moments. One afternoon not long ago, I found myself standing in the backyard watching my children play. The sun was shining. Laughter filled the air. My wife was sitting nearby reading a book. It was one of those scenes people often overlook because nothing dramatic is happening. No celebration. No major achievement. No life-changing event. Just a family enjoying a peaceful day together. Yet as I stood there, I felt something I had spent years searching for without realizing it. Contentment. Not excitement. Not temporary happiness. Something deeper. A quiet appreciation for the life we had built. Positive psychology researchers sometimes describe well-being as the combination of meaning, relationships, accomplishment, engagement, and positive emotions. Looking around that afternoon, I realized our journey had slowly created all of those things. Not overnight. Not through luck alone. Through thousands of small decisions repeated consistently over many years. The fascinating part is that none of the major turning points felt particularly dramatic while they were happening. Learning English together seemed small. Saving money little by little seemed small. Reading books seemed small. Supporting each other through difficult conversations seemed small. Practicing patience seemed small. Yet when combined over time, those small actions completely transformed our lives. This is something many people misunderstand about success. They search for giant breakthroughs while ignoring tiny improvements. But life often changes through accumulation rather than explosion. A single drop of water seems insignificant. Millions of drops can carve through stone. Human growth works in much the same way. Looking back now, I sometimes laugh when I remember how desperately I wanted certainty. I wanted guarantees. I wanted proof that our sacrifices would eventually pay off. Life never provided those guarantees. Instead, it offered opportunities to move forward despite uncertainty. In hindsight, that may have been the better gift. Courage is not developed when outcomes are guaranteed. Courage develops when outcomes are unknown. One evening, our family gathered around the dinner table, and the conversation turned toward old memories. My children wanted to hear stories from the early years. They especially enjoyed hearing about the tiny apartment. To them, it sounded almost unbelievable. They laughed when I described how small the kitchen was. They laughed when I explained how carefully we budgeted every dollar. They laughed when I talked about my early English mistakes. At one point, one of my children asked a question. "Were you unhappy back then?" The question surprised me. I thought about it carefully before answering. The truthful answer was complicated. Sometimes, yes. There were difficult days. Stressful days. Discouraging days. Days when the future felt uncertain. But there was another truth too. We were also hopeful. Curious. Determined. In love. Growing. Learning. Building something together. Happiness and hardship often exist side by side. People sometimes imagine that life moves in a straight line from struggle to happiness. Real life is far messier. Joy appears during difficult seasons. Challenges appear during successful seasons. The goal is not eliminating every problem. The goal is learning how to keep moving forward while appreciating what matters most. As the evening continued, I looked around the table and noticed something remarkable. Everything I had once hoped for was sitting right there. Not perfectly. Not dramatically. Just quietly and beautifully present. The family. The connection. The stability. The laughter. The sense of belonging. Years earlier, these things had existed only as dreams. Now they were reality. That realization brought another lesson into focus. We often underestimate the power of persistence. Motivation receives most of the attention because it feels exciting. Persistence rarely feels exciting. It feels repetitive. Ordinary. Unremarkable. Yet persistence changes lives. The people who eventually achieve meaningful goals are not always the most talented. Often they are simply the ones who continue when progress becomes slow. Our story was never about extraordinary talent. It was about consistency. Showing up. Learning. Adapting. Continuing. One step at a time. Even today, life remains imperfect. Challenges still appear. Unexpected problems still arise. Plans still change. That will probably always be true. The difference is that I no longer fear those challenges the way I once did. Experience has taught me something valuable. Most obstacles look larger before you face them than after you survive them. Confidence grows from evidence. And every challenge overcome becomes another piece of evidence that future challenges can also be managed. Before ending this story, I want to share one final thought. If you are currently going through a difficult season, it may feel as though nothing is changing. Progress may seem invisible. Results may seem distant. You may even wonder whether your efforts matter. Please remember this. Some of the most important transformations happen quietly. Roots grow before branches. Foundations are built before houses. Skills develop before opportunities appear. Keep learning. Keep improving. Keep moving forward. Small steps matter more than they seem. Because one day, perhaps years from now, you may look back and realize that the chapter you almost gave up during became the chapter that changed everything. We had very little money. We faced uncertainty. We made mistakes. We experienced setbacks. But we also had love. And in the end, that love became the foundation for everything that followed. That is what happened next. And honestly, it was worth every step of the journey. Before you leave, I want you to think about one question. What if the hardest chapter of your life is not the end of your story? What if the struggle you are facing right now is quietly preparing you for something greater than you can imagine? Years ago, I believed our lack of money was the biggest problem in our lives. I was wrong. The real danger was losing hope. Because when people lose money, they can earn it again. When people lose opportunities, they can create new ones. But when people lose hope, they often stop walking before reaching the destination that was already waiting for them. Our story was never really about money. It was about love. It was about learning. It was about staying together when life became difficult. It was about taking one small step forward when every reason in the world told us to stop. And maybe that is why you found this video today. Maybe you are learning English. Maybe you are building a new life. Maybe you are fighting through a difficult season that nobody else fully understands. If that's you, remember this. Your future can change faster than you think. A new skill can change a career. A new habit can change a year. A single decision can change an entire life. And one day, the story that makes you cry today may become the story that inspires someone else tomorrow. As you continue your English learning journey, keep listening. Keep reading. Keep speaking. Keep improving. Even if progress feels slow. Even if nobody notices. Even if you make mistakes. Because every word you learn, every sentence you practice, and every day you refuse to quit is building a future version of yourself that will one day thank you. Now I have a question for you. What part of this story touched your heart the most? Was it the tiny apartment? The difficult winter? Learning English together? Or building a family with almost nothing but love? Leave your answer in the comments below. I read as many comments as I can, and your story may inspire someone else in our community. If you enjoyed this slow English story and want more emotional English listening practice, real-life American stories, and inspiring English learning content designed for beginners and intermediate learners, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the next story is even more surprising. It begins with a simple decision that seemed completely harmless at the time. A decision that changed everything. And trust me, you will not see what happens next. Thank you for listening. Thank you for learning with me. And until our next story, keep believing. Keep growing. Keep speaking English. See you in the next video.